Well, good morning. Again, if you're visiting with us today, we're just really glad you're here. The people at this church, I've been here 2 years, going over a little bit, 2 years, and they're really, really nice people. Most of them. So get to know the nice people. I'm glad you're here. We've been in a series on relationships, our relationships. And we talked last week about sometimes the baggage that we carry into relationships. We talked about our griefs, our guilt, and our grudges. Sometimes grudges are often based on either us being difficult or having a difficult relationship or with difficult people. Let me ask you this question. Do you have any difficult people in your life? And then the next question is, how do we handle difficult people? Right? And when I say difficult people, I mean people who may not be the easiest to love, who are maybe hard to love. Someone in our lives, someone we know, maybe even someone very, very close to us, but they're challenging to love. It might be somebody who is just always negative, always super critical about anything you do. Someone in your life who is very ego-driven, right? They're self-absorbed. Maybe someone who's very pushy. They're pushy with their ideas about anything, their values, their beliefs, their political opinions. Someone in your life who's just very hurtful. They've hurt you numerous times, taken advantage of you. Do you have anyone like that in your life? If so, just raise your hand. Right? You raise them high, right? And those who didn't raise your hand, you're probably that person. I mean, how do we deal with that? In our world, in the world that's out there apart from our faith, the world sort of says this basic message, which often we sort of subscribe to. You don't have to deal with them. Just don't let them bother you. Just be nice, be polite, put a smile on your face, but just ignore them. I want you to listen to the words of Jesus, Matthew 5:43. He says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor,'" that's somebody close, "'and hate your enemies.'" That fits what I just said. Love the people that you love. And if there are people you don't like, people that get underneath your skin, don't bother with them. But Jesus didn't stop there. He said this, Matthew 5:44. "But I say to you, love your enemies. Pray for those," can I say it this way, "that drive you nuts, that persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father. Because he makes the sun," this seems out of place, "he makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." In other words, God isn't discriminating between people who are easy to love and people who are hard to love. Look what he says, Matthew 5:46. He says, "For if you only love those that love you," what's that about? what reward do you have? I mean, don't even the bad people, the tax collectors, do that? And if you greet only your brothers and your sisters, what are you doing more than anybody else? Even the Gentiles, the pagans, the people who don't call themselves Christians do that. And then he closes by saying, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Another way of just saying, be like your Father. Now, notice, I think, when you look at those words, Jesus is not that interested. I want to tell you this, because I had to tell myself this. Jesus is not that interested in how well you love your loved ones. People who are easy to love. People who love you back. People who respect you. People who look like you. Think like you. Everybody does that. It's natural. But Jesus seems very concerned about people who are difficult to love. Who are those? The ex that cheated on you. That boss who did not treat you very well. That friend or colleague who stabbed you in the back or spread rumors about you. Here's what I want you to do this morning. And if you want to close your eyes, you can do that. I want you to be really honest, because we all have them, but think for a moment about the most difficult person in your life to love. Just right now, think about them, and if you will do this, just hold them in your mind. Just kind of draw them to mind. The most difficult person in your life to love. And while you're doing that, consider this. Jesus said, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Be like him. And by the way, Jesus is not pointing out some abstract idea of obedience or morality. He is actually thinking of that person that you're thinking about. He is thinking about how you can love that person that's right now in your mind. I got to say it this way. If we're followers of Jesus, if we don't learn to love the difficult people in our lives, that's called into question. Now, how do we do that? The disciples had a very difficult time with that. And in fact, Jesus put them in situations where he could teach them that. So we're going to look at a story. It's very unusual story. You're going to have, by the way, one major question, maybe two major questions when we read this story. And I'm going to address it, but I don't want you to miss the other points of the story, right? Because you know what I mean by that? There's something that troubles you, and then the person's talking about this. You think, well, I don't care about that. I want to know about this. We'll go about that. I got a little bit ADD. All right, so turn to Matthew 15. Now, we're going to have it on the text, on the screen, but I think it's really good for you to have it in your Bible. So I know you got probably a device, so crank it up, and Matthew 15. Matthew 15. Now, Matthew 15, verse 21. Leaving that place. Now, what's that place? It's Galilee. And think of it like this, because of where they're going. Galilee, that's their home. That's their home country. It's familiar people. They're surrounded by family and friends, people they like, people they love, people they want to be around. Leaving that place, it says, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, this is very important because a first century Jew, for them, this is code language. When you mention Tyre and Sidon, it's code language for evil people, right? They didn't like the Samaritans. You remember that? They're right in the middle of Israel. This is way beyond that. This is evil people. This is an area that would be a huge threat to everything they believe. It would be a threat to their values, a threat, because that's a place of idolatry, pagan religion. It's northwest of Galilee. It's quite a distance from Galilee. It's what today would be modern-day Lebanon. So this is the last place in the world that you would typically find a Jewish rabbi taking his disciples. So you have to keep that in mind. This is unusual. Why would Jesus take his men to this spot? This is the most likely place you would find difficult people to love. Then it says this, look at it. A Canaanite woman. That's, again, important. By the way, the word or the adjective Canaanite to describe the woman, it's only used one time in the whole New Testament, right here. And that word is just filled with a kind of a smug attitude, right? In other words, when you hear the word Canaanite today for us, it might be like hearing the word Al-Qaeda. Or it might be hearing the word, make it a little more personal, it would be a word like that Democrats would use for conservatives. Or conservatives might use it for liberals. Just filled with a sense of judgment and disrespect. And she was not just a Gentile woman, she's a Canaanite woman. So let's read it. It says, a Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to Jesus crying out, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly. This is a real person with real problems. And then notice this. Jesus did not answer a word. It's almost like she says all this and he goes, so his disciples, they came to Jesus and they urged him, send her away. She keeps crying after us. Send her away. She's bothersome. That Canaanite woman. We don't need to be around her. Tell her to take a hike. And then Jesus answers, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Well, that's weird. What'd you say? And they didn't say it. They loved it, the disciples. But we say it. I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The woman hears it. The woman came and knelt before him. Lord, help me, she cried. Help me. Jesus says, it's not right to take the children's bread and give it to dogs. And then she says, yes, it is. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Then Jesus was amazed and said to her, "Woman, you have great faith." Wow. Not only do you have great faith, your request is granted. And her daughter was healed at that moment. I mean, what kind of a story is this? Now, is anyone else being a little perplexed by this story? Just raise your hand, right? I am too. So let's close in prayer. No, really, it's almost like the paparazzi caught Jesus having a bad day, right? Kind of an embarrassing moment, but it's caught on camera. A needy woman approaches him, and he basically ignores her, and then seems like he insults her. It's a weird story. And in other words, it ought to be a story about how not to treat difficult people. You know, just on a side note, by the way, a lot of people, not a lot, some people think that all the stories in the gospel were made up. In other words, they all colluded together, the writers, just to make Jesus look good. This story says you got to be out of your mind. You would never include this story in the Gospels. But yet, there is a series of lessons that can help us to understand this whole idea of loving people that are difficult. Here's the first lesson. Now, again, remember, I know you got a lot of questions. We're going to get to that one, but I want you to hear the other ones first. Remember, Jesus, for a very good reason, took them to the enemy's camp. Here's the first lesson. And I see it all the time. Silence your need to be nice. When it comes to difficult people, you have to silence that need, that compulsion that so many church people have, because they think this: my job, my number one goal in following Jesus is to just make sure, if nothing else, that I'm kind of nice to those bad people. When the Canaanite woman first approached Jesus, Jesus doesn't respond. It's kind of rude. But on the other hand, what we don't see is that silence is culturally appropriate. On the other hand, the silence sort of rebukes our way of wanting to fill the gap with trying to be nice. Right? A nice smile, a polite remark, sort of an untrue but polite comment about something. Christians are professional at doing this. But here's the deal. Nowhere in the gospel does Jesus say that the number one goal for you in dealing with people that are tough is just to be nice. Nowhere does he say that because trying to be nice doesn't do the job. When you're being nice, it can often be an impediment to actually learning to love. Because the truth never comes out. Never comes out. See, let me say it this way. You can't love someone if you're just trying to be nice. You can't love someone if the number one thing is just kind of be nice, pleasant, sort of a polite interaction. If you smooth over a conflict with a polite remark, or if you use flattery to win people's affection, or if you just use some kind of nicety in order to avoid a hard conversation. Now, I don't mean by this that you go to the other extreme and be cruel and unkind, but if you want to love a difficult person, if you want to love a difficult person, the first thing you have to do is to let go of that need to just be nice. There's been plenty of marriages that never address the real problem because they're both just nice. Are you with me so far? Just shake your head a little bit. All right, good. 2 people. Here's the second. Avoid avoidance. We tend to do that. We need to learn to avoid avoidance. I say it like this. So often with difficult people, the one thing we want to do is just avoid them. Don't be around them. Be away from them. Try not to be in the same room with them. Avoid them. Now, when you go back to this story, Jesus remains silent. He doesn't say anything, but his disciples do. They come to him. They don't talk to the woman. They come to him. And she's hearing all of this. They're avoiding her. They come to him and say, get rid of her. She's a pain. She's bothersome. Send her away, Jesus. And they don't even have the guts to talk to her. And we do this all the time, don't we, in our lives? We do this all the time in a church. You have difficulties. You have problems with someone. We don't go to that person. We go to another person. And we create a triangulation, right? We avoid hard conversations. We avoid difficult people. We want to steer clear of that because it makes me feel uncomfortable. It's difficult. Someone we feel like might be difficult, or they might be demanding or needy, or maybe they'll take advantage of us, so just avoid them. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus doesn't avoid her. See, what we miss from our perspective, our culture, the most surprising thing about this story is that he speaks to her at all. And I got to go back a little bit of context. In our day, in their day, it would be culturally inappropriate for a Jewish man, especially a Jewish rabbi, to speak to a woman in public, not private, in public. Particularly a Gentile woman, particularly a Canaanite woman, but Jesus does. He does. He doesn't avoid. He doesn't do the safe or the appropriate thing. He engages her. He steps in. He speaks up. He takes a risk because he understands that avoidance, though it feels good in the moment, though it feels safe for the moment, it's a terrible way to deal with difficult people. Why? Because frustration will just build. Hard feelings just grow. Misunderstandings just fester and get worse and spread. So regardless of what the next step may be in your life to love the difficult person, you're going to have to engage them some way. And maybe that means, listen, a hard conversation, means taking some initiative, maybe to tell them how you feel. Maybe it means an apology or to talk about that apology. Maybe it means offering forgiveness. Maybe it means offering a second chance. Bottom line, we have to fight the temptation to avoid. We have to avoid avoidance. Number 3, we need to respect boundaries. Respect your boundaries. You have to know and respect your boundaries. Jesus does this absolutely, clearly in this story. Early on in the story, when the disciples came to him, they said, "Get rid of her." Remember that? Send her away. Send her off. And what does Jesus say? A strange thing, but he says, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." Now, let me give you again a little context that will help us. This is a tough passage. Earlier in his ministry, Jesus had clarified, particularly in the book of Mark, that he was here to reach his fellow Jews. Now, certainly the whole world on the heart, but he wanted to reach the Jews so that they could eventually reach the Gentile world. His mission was to reach his people. But why reiterate this, might be the question, here in a Gentile country, to a Gentile woman? Why just let everybody know what he's doing is basically saying, hey, her problem, not my problem. Because it's actually true. Her problem was not his problem. Jesus understood his boundaries. Jesus was quite clear all through his life that what he was responsible for and that what he wasn't responsible for. That's kind of the ideal of boundaries. To have healthy relationships, you have to have clear boundaries. I have to be able to distinguish what am I responsible for and what's the other person responsible for. See, and this is even more difficult when you have difficult people. Why? Because difficult people, their boundaries are often blurred, or they make your understanding of boundaries blurred. You've had that experience. You might feel guilty thinking about that person. You feel guilty or maybe obligated because of their needs or their request. You sometimes take responsibilities for things that are really not yours. I feel responsible. And so I can feel responsible for someone else's behavior, someone else's choice. Then I feel guilty and obligated about that response. See, when difficult people, when dealing with them, whoever they may be in our lives, when we lack boundaries, it's going to keep us from loving them. Jesus said this thing that, again, I know sounds harsh, and I kind of did it in my own language. Her problem is not my problem. I'm here to teach Israel. Guess what? By making that statement, it gave him the freedom to engage. He didn't feel obligated. He didn't have to do anything. He wasn't worried about her feeling disappointed, which gave him the freedom to listen, to engage, and eventually show love. When you're clear about what your responsibility is and what it isn't, there's a freedom to love a difficult, demanding, needy person in your life. And it's okay if they don't agree. It's okay if they express disappointment. Hey, listen, just so you know, people were disappointed with Jesus all the time. So I wonder how that relationship in your life that you've been thinking about would change if you had a different understanding of your responsibility, if you understood and respected boundaries, right? Think of boundaries as, like in your yard, right? You have a boundary. your yard, whatever the city thing did. And if somebody else's tree grows over and smashes into your yard or whatever, that is violating the boundary. That's why Jesus says, and forgive us the trespasses as we forgive those who trespass on our boundaries. Here's a number 4. Confront your prejudices. Confront your own prejudice, your own bias, your own judgmentalism, your own self-righteousness. See, the hardest part of the story is really about this. After the disciples tried to send the woman away, she comes over to Jesus and she asked him for help. In this innocent and vulnerable moment, she says this, "Lord, help me. Lord, help me." Then Jesus says this surprising thing. Look at it. He says, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to dogs." Why would Jesus say that? Now, I got to do a little deal here because we live in a world where dogs are kind of cuddly and celebrated. We love dogs. In fact, I just saw a sign, an advertisement, where a dog could get a massage, right? You imagine you pay to get a dog. It made me think, if your dog is that stressed out, it doesn't need a massage, it needs a new owner. So in that day, right, you have to see it, in that day, dogs were despised. They were seen as unclean. They were like filthy creatures, much like we think of cats today. And a first century Jew would normally think of this Canaanite woman as a dog. That's what they thought. That was their bias. That was their prejudice. That's what every disciple was thinking. Oh, here comes that dog. They were actually thinking that, which helps us understand why Jesus is putting words to what they're thinking. See, most scholars don't believe he's looking at her and speaking these words to her, but that he's actually looking at his disciples. He is looking at them, testing them, bringing words to what they were actually thinking, putting verbally to life what's going on in their heart. And it makes sense, because if you think about Jesus, he's never treated a woman this way before. It doesn't match the way he treats women. And it doesn't match the way he's eventually going to treat this woman. And more importantly, what did Jesus say that he had come to do? Remember? Before all this happens, he says first, to whom was he here for? The lost sheep of Israel. To teach them. Well, this is what he's teaching his men. He was here to test not the faith of this woman. He was here to test the faith, the assumptions, the biases of the disciples, which is why he put words to their thought. Remember, the disciples, they showed up feeling morally superior, looking down at this woman, judging her from all the externals, thinking she is not worthy of our time and certainly not our love. And they would have been thinking exactly what Jesus said. He just says it out loud. I want you to listen to a scholar named Ken Bailey, and he writes this. He does a great job. He says this about the story, and he's talking about what Jesus is saying to his disciples. I know you think the Gentiles are dogs, and you mean to treat them as such. But pay attention where your bias is leading you. And ask yourself, are you comfortable with that? Now, we, reading it, no, we're not comfortable with it. But they seem to be. They didn't say a word. Here's a question. What if Jesus said what you actually think about the difficult person in your life? What if Jesus actually said what you actually thought of that person in your mind? And then, in the words of Ken Bailey, are you comfortable with that? Would you agree and think, yeah, Jesus, you're on my side. You understand. Thanks for making that statement. I agree with you totally. Dog. Or would you push back and say, wait a minute. This is not right. See, again, Jesus is really testing the faith of his disciples, and they're not passing the test. He is saying, before you reach out and label this woman, take a look at your own heart. You know, when I think about my own heart, I got to tell you this. When I think about my own heart, my own life, and this is true, I think it's probably true for you. So often, the things I don't like in other people, the difficult things I don't like in other people, are things I see in myself, right? You know, I can't believe that person. You know, that person talks so much. And then I realized, man, I talk a lot. Or that person doesn't listen. They're just dismissive of other people. Then I think, gosh, that's me. I went into our secretary, Beth, and I went in, I started talking. We were just doing chit-chat stuff. And it just dawned on me, because she was working, it just dawned on me, I kept thinking, I'm talking too much. And I can't stop. And then I thought, I am boring. I'm actually boring myself. All this was going in my mind while I'm talking, and I couldn't shut up. It was like, hush, go back to your office. Sometimes a person can be so self-absorbed, and then I think, I'm like that. Laura and I went with a couple of other couples up in Bedford when we were there to a guy who was new to the church, and he invited us, and so it was about 3 other couples. So we all went there to this guy's house, you know, very affluent guy. And I'm not kidding you, don't repeat it, but he spent the entire evening dropping names. I mean, but it was so obvious. Like he couldn't, well, you know, when I was there, I met him. And, you know, yes, you're at Citizens Bank. The president of Citizens Bank and we play golf quite a bit. In other words, it went on and on and on and on. And I remember just thinking, And then the thing I also thought was, he's not even aware of it. He's not even aware that he's doing it. So when Laura and I were driving home, I thought, Laura, can you believe that? And then I thought, you know, he's not even aware of it. And it makes me wonder, am I like that? Because I may not be aware of it. And, you know, Laura said, well, you know, we've been married. I know you. You should ask somebody, you know, one of your friends, to see what they think. So the next day when I called Oprah, a long way for zip. You know, if you want to love the difficult person in your life, you have to ask this question: am I also difficult to love? I think about the ways that I frustrate my friends, my colleagues. I think about the ways I often don't care about people, or I'm self-centered. I think about the ways I can be so petty. I think about the ways I can be annoying, or a quick flash of my temper. I remember one time when Taylor was about, 3 or 4, she was doing something really that a 3 or 4-year-old kid would do. But because of other stuff in my life, she got the blunt of a curt, potentially hurtful statement. And, I went to bed that night later, and it really began to bother me. And I couldn't wait till the next morning because I wanted to make it right. Remember, this is a 3-year-old. So the next morning, she's sitting there eating her cereal. I said, Taylor, do you remember yesterday when we did this? And she went, uh-huh. And I said, I am so sorry. Daddy was not nice. And I want you to forgive me. And her response was this: Daddy, I still love you. Right? It's like, Daddy, I still love you. Who knows? The truth may be the hardest person for God to love in my life is me. Because I know what's in here. I know my thoughts, my actions, my beliefs, my choices. I know what I'm capable of. But you know what? That's how God thinks about difficult people. I still love you. That's how God thinks about his enemies. I still love you. And that's his message, not just for the difficult person in your life today. That's his message for you. I still love you. How do I know? Because 2,000 years ago on a cross, Jesus died not for people who were easy to love, but for people who were very hard to love. I still love you. I still love you. Father, forgive them. Would you bow? I want to invite you right now just to think about that person in your life. And we're going to pray for them. And I know normally when I pray for difficult people, I usually pray this way: God, make them change, make them apologize, make them grow up, make them get better, make them go away. God, just make them. We're going to change that prayer. We're going to learn the prayer of the Canaanite woman. God, help me. Help me. God, help me see them the way you see them. God, help me to initiate. Help me to have the hard conversations. Help me to love. Help me to forgive. Help me do what feels impossible for me to do. So therefore, God, help me. Help right now. Help us as a church to be able to love the difficult. Help us in our relationships. Help us to avoid the compulsion just to be nice, which is another way of avoiding. Help us to love like you did. Father, break our hearts this morning. May we be the kind of community that's known not just for liking the people we like, but for loving the people we don't. Help us to do that this week. And we pray it in your name. Amen.